I didn't think too much about the social inclusion one because I think that the democracy one has to be solved first in order for social inclusion to be kind of meaningfully thought about and pursued. So I had done a bit of thinking about specifically how democracy and questions of memory politics might be related and interrelated. And for me, it comes down to the single word accountability. And democracy itself rests on accountability and requires accountability for all kinds of reasons. The most obvious one is that if democracy means rule by the people, it means that public authorities are accountable to the people, and that's what the mechanism of elections every 4 years or so is supposed to be about. It's that opportunity for the electorate to kind of give their judgment on the performance of authorities and to punish mistakes and carelessness, and indeed perhaps even to punish evil. But you need more accountability than that for a democracy to function. It can't just be the public rendering a verdict every 4 years. It also means that the public has some sort of meaningful chance to supervise the exercise of public power and political authority. And that requires, above all, that authorities make their decisions public, that they explain their decisions, that they defend their decisions, that they submit to regular questioning, and so on and so forth. And that gets us to the actual root of the word accountability, which people tend to kind of confuse with the idea of negative consequences, that holding someone accountable is supposed to mean, throwing them in jail or firing them from their jobs. But really, at root, the idea of accountability is to give an account, to account for oneself, to explain, to defend, to submit to questioning. And that is absolutely essential to democracy. If democracy is going to be anything more than a bunch of kind of serial, indisciplined wrongdoers, it requires that authorities explain themselves, especially when there's been wrong done, when people are harmed, when there's been, anything ranging from direct malfeasance to mistakes and carelessness. You have to be able to put those authorities under questioning, make them explain what they've done so that people can learn, so that future authorities can learn, and so that the electorates whose job it is to hold public power accountable can learn from previous bad examples of the use of public authority. So democracy and accountability are really tightly related in those ways. And the real promise of memory politics in relation to accountability then is that you're building some kind of democratic learning and accountability through questioning, looking at accounts of wrongdoing, understanding where evil comes from in terms of how it was materialized in past public policies. Doing that over the long haul so that you build political communities of responsibility and accountability, not just every 4 years through elections, but transgenerationally. And so that there's learning over longer historical arcs. I think that's the promise of democracy and accountability in relation to memory politics. In a nutshell, there's no democracy without accountability, and there's no accountability without memory. And so the idea of memory politics is about pursuing that kind of promise of democracy over a longer haul and building communities and mass publics that are responsible. For me, memory politics means forms of politics that are explicitly informed by recollection and by forms of collective recollection, because politics is not something that happens inside one individual body or one individual head. It's a collective, it's a group activity. And so memory politics means the coming together of groups, different collectivities, mass publics, sub-publics, groups within the public, to use forms of collective remembrance and recollection explicitly to demand change, to demand reform, to make better worlds, to collectively govern ourselves better, all the things that politics at its best is supposed to promise us. There's a certain kind of ordinary or banal level at which all politics is memory politics, that creating the kind of communities that are associated with democratic politics in the 20th century requires memory in the form of explaining to people the nature of the system and the community that they belong to, giving them some sort of sense of some kind of collective inheritance and some sort of shared responsibility for the future. There's all kinds of rituals of memory that are used to do that. And so memory and politics have been connected since the birth of the nation state, which, as Benedict Anderson and other people famously kind of explained, that building political communities over larger geographic distances also seem to require not just mass media and newspapers and ways of connecting information across those distances, but also connecting communities over time, making them see themselves as the inheritors of something that came before, and making the members of the nation see themselves as contributors to something that was going to go on beyond them. So that's the nation state, and democratic politics have always been about memory in that sense. But I think that when we talk about memory politics from the late 20th century to the early decades of the 21st, we've got something more explicit in mind, which is the coming together of different kinds of collectivities on the basis of collective remembering to try to demand or drive some sort of change. The responses of governments and public authorities and states to those kinds of memory politics, the coming together of groups that have shared recollections of trauma and exclusion, genocide, all kinds of injustice. States have responded to that with the kind of formalized practices that we would now associate with memory politics. And those are things like political apologies or truth commissions or various kinds of regretful commemoration. For example, observing the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation is a way of building some kind of community through the shared remembering of trauma and evil and wrongdoing. And so, in the 21st century right now, when we talk about memory politics, it's that kind of combination of demands for change coming out of communities organized through shared memories of wrong and harm, and then the responses of dominant groups and states to those demands through the kinds of things that we associate with memory politics. Truth commissions, apologies, other kinds of commemorations, curriculum reform, museum reform, statue removals. There's no shortage. There's a kind of combination in the 20th century of grave evil, grave wrong, and grave harm on the one hand, and a certain kind of promise and optimism on the other. And I think it's out of the kind of conflict or contradiction or space between the harm and the wrong on the one hand and the optimism and the openness on the other that generates what we now understand as memory politics. So I think it's the historian Winkler called the 20th century the century of catastrophe, or the age of catastrophe. And what he and other scholars mean when they talk about the 20th century that way is that this was the kind of first time in human history when the state had the technological and bureaucratic capabilities to engage in systematic race-based internment, to initiate eugenic schemes, to pursue genocide in very kind of calculated, sometimes militarized, often bureaucratized means. And that there's this combination of evil ideologies like white supremacy on the one hand, and the technological capabilities to do grave wrong as seen in bureaucracies, militaries, and other kind of forms of 20th century technologies on the other, that you generate this century of catastrophe, a century of genocides, a century of the kind of formal creation of schemes of second-class citizenship, a century of race-based internments. Then on the other hand, and so the 20th century is quite rightly looked back upon with a unique kind of remembered sense of horror. And coming out of that remembered horror is that well-known post-Holocaust cry, never again. But at the same time, the 20th century is, in many parts of the world, a century of promises, a century of the promise of mass democracy, a century of the promise of social welfare, of technological solutions to human problems, of almost a certain kind of utopianism associated with ideas like the end of history or the age of affluence. In that contradiction between the kind of possibilities and the promises of democracy and social welfare on the one hand, and the realities of mass bureaucratized evil on the other, I think you get this pressure to generate some kind of learning from the experiences of the 20th century that then kind of materializes in demands for regretful commemoration, for redress, for forms of politics that are explicitly dedicated to learning about and not repeating those horrors. But you wouldn't get the pressures for the learning and the remembrance without the promise of there being something better, that if history and life were experienced as nothing but unremitting horror and catastrophe, people wouldn't bother attempting to learn from wrongs and from episodes of mass evil. It would just be, a kind of endless state of affairs that people would submit to. But they haven't and they don't, because there is, however flawed, however hypocritical, some kind of promise in some of the ideals of liberal democracy and social equality and social welfare. So we're talking about the 20th century as the age of catastrophe, in which engaging with remembered horrors generated demands for reparation and regretful commemoration and truth commissions and apologies and the kind of collective learning that memory politics is supposed to generate. And I think for a lot of the world, one of the kind of key flashpoints that makes the 20th century that century of remembered horrors would be the end of World War I and Versailles and the Treaty of Versailles, in which explicitly white-dominated powers sat down and carved up the world amongst themselves and harnessed the idea of self-determination to the idea of white supremacy and decided that self-determination was for white-dominated states, and then at the same time carved up much of the Arab world and much of the Black African world as well, amongst these white-dominated colonial powers. And it's out of that remaking of the world explicitly along these principles of colonialism and white supremacy that you get genocides and mass famines and race-based internment and schemes of second-class citizenship. But I did want to observe that there's a way in which the creation of Canada is a bit of a preview of that carving up the world among powers, white-dominated powers along white supremacist lines. And that's the sense in which the creation of Canada as a federation in 1867 involved declaring, as the Canadian Constitution of 1867 puts it, declaring Indians and lands reserved for Indians items of exclusive federal jurisdiction. So they're treated in Canada's founding constitution of 1867 the same way that it treats banks or the post office or the power to issue liquor licenses or anything like that as not even human life. And that's a real, it's a significant rejection of a previous history, however incomplete and however disappointing and hypocritical, but still it's a repudiation of an earlier history in which First Nations were supposed to be treaty partners, and earlier constitutional documents directed Canadian authorities to make treaty. And that non-treaty approach to Indigenous peoples, declaring them topics of federal government jurisdiction, and then carving up the country among white-dominated political communities known as provinces, can be seen in a certain kind of way as reflecting the same logic, the same assumptions, the same kind of political technologies that then went to be applied to the world on a much greater scale in World War I. And so that's just all to say that Canada has its own special particular history of injustice with its own particular founding moments that might surprise many people to realize go back a little bit farther than the horrors of the 20th century.